The Arizona desert is not known for its mild climate or its beauty, but for a 9-year-old in 1940, that desert was a magical place. We lived in Congress Junction, tiny little town 20 miles outside of Wickenburg on Highway 89 between Phoenix and Prescott. My mom, my grandma and grandpa, and my older brother were all together there that year. Mom was divorced. Grandma and Grandpa ran a business there called the Congress House. The Congress House was the town post office. It was a dry goods store where you could buy all kinds of work clothes and things like that. Work pants in any color you wanted as long as it was blue denim. There was a 4-bedroom motel with an actual flush toilet at the end of the hall and a shower. And there was a cafe. We used to have lunch almost every day in the cafe. My 2 favorite meals were hamburger and a milkshake or grilled cheese and milk. No vegetables, thank you. I remember sitting on those tall stools at the counter, the two stools that twirled. At the other end of town, there was another cafe and a grocery store. There were 2 service stations in town, gas stations. Gas stations were a lot different in those days. They had the gas in a tank underground and a pump with a big glass cylinder on top. And you'd get the handle on the pump and you'd actually pump the gas out of the ground into the glass bulb that was measured in gallons. And when it reached the 5 gallons, then you put the hose in your car and gravity feed the gas into your tank. If you wanted more than 5 gallons, then you had to pump again to get the gas in the bulb. There were probably 6 houses between the 2 businesses, and they all had Mexican families in them. In fact, in Congress Junction in itself, there was probably only 2 or 3 white families altogether. Congress Junction was right at the base of Yarnell Hill. Yarnell Hill was part of the Mogollon Rim that goes clear across the state. And it raises quite a bit from the desert floor up to top of the rim. Yarnell Hill, we could see it from the house, and it just looked like the road went right straight up like this, up to the top of the hill at a, I don't know, 20, 30 degree angle. When you got up to the top of Yarnell Hill, there was a little community up there, and actual trees grew up there on the top of the mountain. there was a dirt road that crossed the highway right where Congress Junction is, or where the Congress House. And the railroad ran parallel with the highway on the other side of the highway. And then there were some more houses over there, and our schoolhouse was over there. I don't know where the dirt road went either direction, but I know if you went past the school and down that way, we came to a place called Burrow Creek. Burrow Creek wasn't much of a creek, but right there near the road, there was a swimming hole. Must have been a spring because the water was clear and blue, and it was always there. It was an oasis, and we'd go swimming and picnicking. And there at Burrow Creek in that swimming hole, it was so deep that my mom never could reach the bottom when she would dive down to see how deep it was. Across the dirt street from the Congress House, the first house on the road was the Orquitas house. Bobby Orquitas was my best friend. We were the only two kids in the 3rd grade. And if we went down the dirt road about a quarter of a mile, there was a big wash. Didn't ever have any water in it, but it had some steep banks, dirt banks, and we used to make roads and play with our trucks and little cars, and we built houses out of flat stones and use mesquite branches, little twigs for fences and trees and that sort of thing. Quarter of a mile away from the house, so it was too far away to hear people hollering for us to come home. So we had complete freedom out there in the desert. We had a lot of adventures, playing bullfight and being chased by wild cows with big sharp horns, hunting rattlesnakes. If we caught a rattlesnake at Arizona State University in Phoenix, there was a professor named Dr. Stonke, and Dr. Stonke would buy the rattlesnakes because they used the snake venom to make anti-venom, and they did that at the university. So we were always on the look for snakes that we could catch. If you take a snake and put him in a little burlap sack, you can throw it up across your back or whatever. Well, as long as he's in that sack, he's not worried about trying to bite anything. So it was just a matter of getting them in the sack. Chuckawallas are a big lizard, 12, 14 inches long. And they would go between two rocks and suck in air and bloat their body. So if you grabbed their tail and tried to pull them out, they'd be stuck between the rocks. We used to chase chuckawallas and play with them. Once we found a beehive in some rocks on the ground, and we thought it'd be fun to throw rocks at it. It was fun for about 30 seconds. Then when the bees came out and started stinging, it was no longer any fun. I don't remember even owning a pair of shoes. We did everything in the desert barefoot. It didn't bother us at all. Bobby's mom didn't speak much English, but she was a really good cook. Her name was Evie Orquitas. sometimes we'd have lunch at Bobby's house. And to a little kid, the tortillas she made seemed like they were huge. And she'd throw them on the grill and cook them and spread beans on them and roll them up. And Bobby and I'd walk down the road eating our bean burros, great big things. It was a lot of fun. I remember that when it was cold enough that when you breathed, you could see your breath. It was always fun because we'd get some candy cigarettes, like these right here. Only these don't have a red tip. The candy cigarettes we had a red tip on them, and we'd smoke them as we walked down the street, pretending to smoke those cigarettes. And one time, a lady called Grandma and said, "Those boys are out smoking cigarettes." We thought that was really fun. The schoolhouse in Congress Junction was one large room that had a partition curtain in the middle of it. And on the side, there was a little stage where we put on plays. I remember doing the Big Billy Goat's Gruff. If you don't know that story, that's a story for another time. But all of the community activities were held in the schoolhouse. With the partition closed, Mrs. Ferguson taught grades 1 through 4. She had one row for each grade. Like I said, Bobby and I were the only two desks in the 3rd grade. Some had 1, some had none, some had 3. Mr. Ferguson, on the other side of the partition, taught the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grades. And after you graduated from 8th grade, you'd take the bus into Wickenburg. It was a 20-mile ride both ways. Mr. Ferguson was the principal, so he was a disciplinarian. And discipline was really simple because for minor infractions, you'd hold your hand out and get whacked with a ruler. For more major infractions, like pulling girls' pigtails, you had to bend over and grab your ankles and present your bottom to Mr. Ferguson for a good swat with his paddle. Discipline wasn't a big problem. The schoolyard wasn't very large, and the big kids didn't want to do the same games and things as the little kids. So our recess was staggered. We weren't out at the same time. And I remember the favorite games that we played were things like tag and kickball. And the school didn't have an indoor toilet, but out on the edge of the playground there was a 4-holer. 2 holes for the boys on one side and 2 holes for the girls on the other side. It was a good time, an old-fashioned time. We probably had a total of maybe 20 students because we had kids from outlying ranches come in. Mrs. Ferguson taught the row at a time. She'd go to one row and she'd give a lesson and then assign some work for the student to do, and then she'd go to the next row present a lesson, make an assignment, keep the kids busy, and she cycled through the 4 rows, and then she'd start over again. And that's the way school was taught, to 4 grades at the same time in the same room. Yarnell Hill was a steep hill for driving, and even though it was paved, it was only 1 lane. And so if 2 cars met, one going downhill and one going uphill, and there wasn't room for them to get past each other, then the car that was going uphill would have to back down till it was wide enough for both of them to pass each other. For if you met a truck, that sometimes meant you had to back up a long time for the room for a truck to get by. If truck drivers weren't real familiar with that hill, they may not gear down at the top of the hill, and then they'd get going too fast and they'd be riding their brake, and when the brakes get hot, they no longer will work. They don't stop anything, and you lose control. And it wasn't unusual for trucks to go off the road and tumble down the mountain. One morning, we got up and you look up on Yarnell Hill and it looked like it had snowed. But it was very unusual because the snow was just in one spot on the mountain. And we didn't know what that meant. So we all piled in Grandpa's old Plymouth and we drove up there. And what had happened was a truck went off the side and it caught on fire. The truck was loaded with Jolly Time popcorn. And popcorn, the Jolly Time popcorn, wasn't in cardboard boxes. It was sealed in tin cans. And when those cans got hot and the corn started to pop, the can would explode and there'd be a fountain of popcorn. And popcorn was spread all over the hill there where it looked like it had snowed. And we kids jumped out of the car and went down the mountain down there and were grazing on that popcorn. It was really a fun time. Grandpa was a prospector, and whenever he could, he was out in the desert prospecting for gold or silver or copper or whatever he could find. One time he and I were out prospecting, and of course I was barefoot. I never wore shoes. And we were on our way home. When we got back to the car, We were clear out in the middle of nowhere, just a dirt road going someplace. And I asked Grandpa if I could drive. I was 9 years old. Grandpa said, sure. And so, got in the car. I had to sit right up on the front edge of the seat and look under the steering wheel so I could see the road. Grandpa showed me how to shift the gear shift that was on the steering column and showed me how to use the clutch. And we started off. Well, the first thing that happened was the gas pedal, which was metal, got real hot. It was close to the firewall with the engine, and the temperature was probably 110 degrees, and it was burning my bare foot. And so without slowing down or doing anything, I managed to take my t-shirt off and get it down on the gas pedal so that I could had some way to cool my foot. I did that without slowing down. And I remember looking ahead, and I saw a cattle guard. And the cattle guard was narrower than the road. So I pulled in the middle of the road and I aimed and bum, 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 went across the cattle guard. And I said, I made it. And Grandpa said, huh, what? Gone to sleep. He didn't tell Grandma that he let me drive home that day. Cattle and goats and sheep were the animals that the ranchers down on the desert raised. And to get them to market, they'd drive their herds into Congress Junction, where there was a small stockyard. And from there, they'd order train cars that were for stock. Then they'd have to drive them from the stockyards across a highway and into the railroad right-of-way, and then have ramps that they drive the cattle or whatever up the ramp into the cars. The stockyards was right next to the Congress House. And the fences in the stockyard were probably 7-8 feet tall, and then we built with 8x8 posts. And on top of the fence, there was a 2x10 board flat that was nailed up there, and you could walk the fence all the way around right on top of the fence. And we used to play tag. All the kids, we'd get together, 6 or 7 of us, and we'd play tag. If you touched the ground, fell off the fence, you were it. Or if you could catch somebody, you were it. In those stockyards, there was 3 or 4 pins and an aisle in the front. And there were 2 big gates. And those gates swung on hinges this way to close this pin and have the aisle open, or it would swing on this hinge and go across the aisle and shut the aisle off and leave the pin open, or it'd swing around to the other side and close this pin. if you had somebody chasing you and you could get to where the end of the fence was, or gate, you could jump on the gate and push off and swing around to a different position and get off and leave your pursuer stranded with no way to get to you. And boy, we just had wonderful times playing there in the stockyards and playing tag. The stockyards was right next to the Congress House, so whenever ranchers would bring stock into the stockyards, we kids had a ringside seat to watch all the action. One time, a rancher brought in a herd of Angora goats, and a little kid had been born on the trail. The rancher brought the kid in on his saddle with him, but he had no way to take care of the kid until it was time to load onto the train. So he gave the kid to us, and we raised this baby Angora goat and had a lot of fun with him till he got real big and real stinky, and we had to give him back to the rancher. We lived in Congress Junction for a little more than a year, and then we moved, and my time in 9-year-old Paradise Junction was over.